What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another video, and yes, the title is correct. I've basically been shooting on one lens for the past year, and that is the Canon RF 15-35 f2.8. And so now you might be asking, why? Why only one lens? And I think to answer that, if we go back to when I was deciding between the R6 and R5, I basically had $5,000 to spend. And so I could either do an R5 with a 24-105, or I could do the R6 and get either the 15-35 or 24-70 f2.8. And as you probably know, I went with the R6 and I went with the RF 15-35. And I think part of that had to do with I was coming from the Lumix S1, and with that camera I had the 24-105, and so I was just pretty much done shooting with that focal range. I'd shot with a 24-105 for the past couple of years, and so I really wanted to change it up and get something like the 15-35. I also really wanted to start a YouTube channel, this specific YouTube channel, and I know that a lot of creators love and use the 16-35, or in Canon's case, the 15-35, for stuff like this, just talking to camera, traveling, documenting vacations, just all of that kind of stuff. And so that all really played into why I wanted the 15-35 instead of something like a 24-70. I think if you're gonna do professional work and you're doing weddings, corporate events, stuff like that, the 24-70 or 24-105 probably makes more sense. But this isn't my main camera. This isn't what I use professionally. This is just something that I can use to make videos for you guys and kind of take with me on my travels and just document my life. With that kind of backstory out of the way, let's get into some pros and cons for the RF 15-35. So the first big pro for the 15-35 is the optical quality. So this is Canon's top of the line wide angle zoom lens, and I have shot a little bit with the EF version, so the EF 16-35 version 3, and that isn't image stabilized. So having a 15-35 that is image stabilized and is, in my opinion, a significant bump in sharpness, especially like corner sharpness. You'll notice if you're coming from an EF 16-35, the RF version is significantly sharper in the corners, and at 2.8, this is still a very sharp and usable lens. This shot right now is at f2.8. I think we're at 20 millimeters, give or take. So this is the quality that you can expect. I do have a mist filter on this, so that is softening the image ever so slightly, but if you are using it for photos and if you don't have a filter on, this is an incredibly sharp lens at 2.8. And as you stop down to like f8, if you're shooting landscapes, f8, f10, f12, it is tack sharp at 15 millimeters, at 35 millimeters, and really anywhere in between. There's also very little vignetting. If you turn on profile corrections, that goes away immediately. There's also very little distortion. If you notice in RAW files, toggling on and off the camera profile, it's not correcting for a ton of distortion. And so if you want to use this lens for architecture work or something like that, you're getting a very clean image straight out of camera. Something like the RF 14-35 has quite a significant amount of distortion, and again with the RF 16, which came out, both of these lenses came out after the 15-35, there's a lot of distortion correction that is being done, whereas the 15-35 is a pretty clean image straight out of camera. I think the next big pro is build quality. About a week after I bought this camera, I took it down to our lake and we were doing some kayaking, and I was dropping my brother off. And when he opened the back door to my truck to get some of his kayaking gear out, I heard the thud of a camera hitting the ground. And so this was a week after I bought the R6 and the 15-35. So my heart sank, and I went around and he was like picking up the camera off the ground. And luckily I had a lens cap on because it hit lens first, and the lens cap popped off. Weirdly enough, the camera and the lens itself didn't have a scratch on it. So I really lucked out in that, but this is a camera that pretty much fell out of the back of a truck 4 feet up, lens first, and that was over a year ago, and I've never had any issues with this lens. I think Canon has done an excellent job weather sealing this lens, and that really shows whenever you're in more extreme conditions like the freezing cold and the summer heat. This lens doesn't skip a beat. The autofocus, the image stabilization, everything is rock solid, and that's kind of why you're paying this premium. The last big pro, and I hit on this earlier, is the EF 16-35 f2.8 never did have image stabilization, and this does. Whenever the lens first came out, there was some severe wobble issues with the R6 and R5, and there have been firmware updates to help remedy a lot of that, but it can still happen, but it's definitely less frequent and it's less noticeable now. And then if you do shoot on something like a C70 that doesn't have a stabilized sensor, the image stabilization in this lens doesn't wobble or doesn't do anything kind of weird. It is rock solid. And on the photography side of things, I've handheld shots down to 1 second or 1.5 seconds, just holding the camera in front of me, and the images coming out are tack sharp. If you do a lot of shooting in low light, or if you do a lot of video work, having image stabilization in a lens like this is super helpful. Now let's move over to cons. There's not a ton of them, but there are a few, and let's start off with the size and the weight. This is a big, heavy lens. Canon has put a ton of glass in there. There's a lot of elements, and that shows in just the sheer size and weight of it. If you are shooting in public, people are gonna notice it. So if you want something that's a little more under the radar, something like the 16mm f2.8 that Canon has out is gonna draw a lot less attention than something like the 15-35. Next is the IBIS wobble. Like I mentioned earlier, there have been firmware updates to the R5 and R6 to help mitigate this wobble effect, but it is still there. So if you do a lot of shooting at 15mm with the lens IS on, you are going to have some shots that come back with this weird corner wobble. In my opinion, it is still a very usable lens. Like I said, I've shot all year using it, and I've shot with IS on pretty much all year round, but there you will get the occasional shot here or there that the wobble just kind of ruins. And lastly is price. It is expensive. At the time, the 15-35 was the only wide angle lens Canon had out when I first purchased this, but since then they have released the 14-35, a 16mm f2.8, and then just last week they released a 15-30 non-L lens, and all of these options are at least $700 or more cheaper than what the 15-35 is. This is really something that you're gonna have to ask yourself, like, do I have a budget for this? And is this lens worth it for you? I think if you are a professional, this is still Canon's top dog wide angle lens, and I think it will be for quite some time. The 14-35 is about $700 cheaper, and I think if you're a landscape photographer, if you don't need that f2.8, then the 14-35 makes more sense. But if you want the best of the best, the 15-35 is it, and I think that it does not disappoint for the price. Now, circling back to the beginning, like I said, I've been using this lens pretty much exclusively for the past year, and when I first pitched the idea of buying the R6, everybody said buy a 24-70 or a 24-105. Buying a 15-35 in pretty much everybody's opinion was a dumb idea, and so that's exactly what I did, and I don't regret that. There have been very few shots over this past year that I've kind of regretted having this lens and not something like a 24-105. With that being said, I think my next lens purchase will be a 70-200, because I've found that the shots that are missing are the really long detail kind of shots that I can get with a 70-200. I think the ideal kit for me is a 15-35 a 50 mil, and then a 70 to 200. That will get me all the way from 15 millimeters all the way up to 200 with only a few gaps in between, which I can fill out later with some cheap primes. And that is it for today's video. I hope you guys took something from it. As somebody that has shot in the 24 to 105 range a lot in their life, buying something a little different like a 15 to 35 or a 70 to 200 is a great way to reignite that creativity and the love for photography and video making. It's allowed me to start this channel, and I think it has allowed me to grow as a photographer. Limiting myself to just that focal range has pushed me to get photos that I probably wouldn't do if I didn't have this kind of lens. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.